In the endless white of the Alaskan wilderness, sound disappears. The snow absorbs everything, the whine of the wind, the crunch of boots, the whisper of breath freezing midair. It's a landscape so vast, so unforgiving, that even a scream can vanish into nothing. And for more than a decade, that silence hid a secret, a hunter who didn't chase moose or caribou, but women. His name was Robert Hansen, and Anchorage would come to know him as the Butcher Baker. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Alaska was a wild frontier for dreamers and drifters alike. Oil money had transformed Anchorage into a booming town of bars, strip clubs, and transient workers, men chasing fortune, women chasing escape. Amid that chaos, Hansen blended in perfectly, a mild-mannered baker, a family man, a respected business owner. He wore glasses, spoke softly, and kept mostly to himself. But behind the thick lenses and quiet demeanor lived a man consumed by rage, humiliation, and an urge to control what had once humiliated him. He was the kind of man no one suspected, a quiet husband who rose before dawn to bake bread and pies, who went home early to his wife and children, who spent weekends hunting in the Alaskan backcountry. But his trophies weren't always the kind that could be mounted on walls. It began with disappearances, women from the 4th Avenue strip dancers, sex workers, the ones society already ignored. They'd vanish between paydays, leaving behind clothes IDs, sometimes a half-packed bag, in a dingy motel room. Police shrugged at first. These women moved often. They came and went. Some said they'd gone south, some said they'd overdosed. But deep in the woods, Hansen was playing a darker game. He would lure them with promises, money, a photo shoot, a ride out of town. Then the mask would drop. The kind baker would become the predator. He'd bind them, assault them, then fly them in his small plane to the wilderness, remote, untouched, where no one could hear their screams. And there he'd set them free. Not to live, but to run. Hansen would hunt them like game, stalking them through the trees with his rifle, taking pleasure in their terror. When the chase ended, the silence of Alaska swallowed another secret. For years his crimes went unnoticed. Bodies were occasionally found buried shallow in the tundra, frozen like broken dolls, but no one connected the dots. It took a young woman's escape to shatter the illusion. In June 1983, a handcuffed 17-year-old girl named Cindy Paulson ran barefoot through the streets of Anchorage, crying for help. She told police a story that sounded impossible. A man had kidnapped her, chained her in his basement, and threatened to take her into the wilderness to hunt her. Her description of the house, the plane, and the man was detailed. Yet when detectives looked into it, their suspect seemed the least likely man in the city to be a sadistic killer. Robert Hansen was polite, cooperative, a churchgoer, married with kids. He ran a bakery known for its fresh pastries. He had friends in the police department and a clean reputation. And yet something in his calm, in the way his hands didn't shake when confronted with Cindy's accusations, unsettled the detectives. The case might have died there, buried like the others. But Detective Glenn Floth, an investigator with the Alaska State Troopers, refused to let it go. He saw a pattern: missing women found in similar shallow graves across the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. He started to believe the unthinkable, that a respected local man was behind one of the most chilling serial crimes in Alaskan history. For months, Floth gathered evidence in silence. He studied flight logs, tracked gun purchases, and interviewed women who had narrowly escaped encounters with a man matching Hansen's description. Piece by piece, the mask began to crack. When the truth finally came to light, it stunned even veteran officers. The mild baker had hunted at least 17 women, maybe more. He'd buried their bodies across miles of frozen terrain, marking their resting places on a map with little X, as if they were nothing more than trophies. The world would come to know him as the Butcher Baker, a nickname that captured both his two lives, the innocent man who made pastries and the monster who carved pain into the Alaskan wilderness. But beyond the crimes, beyond the horror, the story of Robert Hansen is also a story about isolation, misogyny, and the dangerous mix of fantasy and revenge. In a land that rewards self-reliance and punishes weakness, Hansen's double life thrived. No one looked too closely at a man who could shoot, fly, and bake, a man who seemed to embody the Alaskan dream. but underneath he was the nightmare hiding in plain sight. And as the snow fell over Anchorage that winter, covering the earth in white silence, once again no one knew how many secrets were buried beneath it, how many voices the wilderness had already swallowed whole. Morning in Anchorage smelled of frost and diesel. The sun barely broke through the clouds, a pale orange smear over a city still half asleep. Inside a small bakery on 9th Avenue, the rhythmic thud of kneading dough mixed with the low hum of fluorescent lights. A man worked alone, sleeves rolled up his thin frame, moving methodically, fold, press, cut, repeat. His name was Robert Christian Hansen, and he was the kind of man you would never notice twice. To most people, he was just Bob the baker. A quiet man with a stutter glasses perpetually slipping down his nose and a nervous smile that seemed to apologize for his very existence. He served fresh bread and pies to policemen, truckers, and mothers. He kept his head down, paid his taxes, went to church. But every man carries two versions of himself, the one he shows the world and the one that watches from the dark. Robert Hansen was born in Esterville, Iowa in 1939, an awkward, frail boy raised under the stern hand of a Danish immigrant father who owned a bakery. From a young age, Hansen learned discipline, silence, and shame. His stutter made him a target at school. Girls laughed when he tried to talk to them. Boys mocked his trembling voice. He withdrew into himself, finding solace only in the rigid world of routines, kneading dough, cleaning ovens, counting hours until the day ended. But resentment, once buried deep, never dies. It grows quietly, feeding on rejection. In Hansen's mind, a narrative began to form. Women were cruel, beauty was a weapon, and he was its victim. At 16, he found something that made him feel powerful hunting. In the woods, he didn't stutter. He didn't blush. The animals didn't laugh or mock. They feared him. The rifle steadied his hands. The precision of the kill thrilled him. Out there, he wasn't the shy baker's son. He was a hunter. By the time Hansen moved to Alaska in 1967, he'd already been married twice. Both relationships collapsed under his temper and his need for control. But in Anchorage, he was reborn. Alaska was the last frontier, wild, lawless, full of people running from their pasts. Hansen fit right in. He opened a small bakery, remarried, had 2 children, and bought himself a small plane, a Piper Super Cub. He loved that plane. It gave him freedom. It made him untouchable. He also earned a reputation among hunters. In 1969, he set world records with a doll sheep and a black bear, and his name was printed in the Pope and Young bow hunting record book. To his fellow sportsmen, he was meticulous and humble. To his family, distant but dependable. No one ever guessed that beneath his soft voice and polite manners was a man who fantasized about revenge against every woman who had ever made him feel small. Anchorage in the 1970s was a strange mix of boomtown energy and moral decay. Oil money had flooded in fueling bars, strip clubs, and brothels. The city's 4th Avenue pulsed at night, neon lights flickering over sex workers, drunks, and soldiers spending paychecks before they were gone again. It was a place where the lost could disappear without anyone asking questions. And Hansen, the quiet baker, haunted those streets like a ghost. He'd cruise slowly in his pickup eyes, scanning the sidewalks. To the women working there, he was just another lonely man, polite and soft-spoken. He offered them money, sometimes double their usual rate. He seemed safe, old or nervous, the kind who wouldn't fight back. They didn't know that once they stepped into his truck, they were entering the mouth of the wilderness itself. His crimes began small: arson, theft, petty violence. In 1960, long before the killings, Hansen had burned down a school bus garage in his Iowa hometown out of sheer resentment toward the community that mocked him. He spent time in prison and was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder and an infantile personality. But those records were left behind when he came north. Alaska was forgiving to men with bad pasts. Out there, no one cared where you came from. By the early 1970s, Hansen's violence escalated. He was accused of kidnapping and assaulting women, but each time he slipped away, his family man image and community reputation shielding him from scrutiny. Police dismissed his victims as unreliable sex workers, dancers, troublemakers. He was fined, placed on probation, released. No one imagined that this shy baker could be capable of cruelty on such scale. But the mask was starting to slip. At home, Hansen kept meticulous lists, fantasies of women he wanted, things he wanted to do to them, places he wanted to take them. He built a small soundproof room in his basement under the pretense of storing hunting gear. He kept chains, ropes, a Remington rifle, and Polaroid photos. He had learned how to control his world down to the smallest detail. In his mind, the hunt wasn't about lust, it was about control. He wanted to flip the script. In his fantasies, the women who had once laughed now begged. They ran through the woods barefoot, crying, their breath visible in the cold. He was the god of that frozen wilderness. They were his prey. What made Hansen even more dangerous was his patience. He didn't kill in frenzy or rage. He planned, he watched, he selected, and when he was done, he'd return to his bakery before dawn, dusted in flour instead of snow, serving pastries with the same hands that had buried bodies hours earlier. In many ways, Robert Hansen was the perfect predator for his time and place. Anchorage was a transient city. People came and went, records were poorly kept, and the wilderness stretched endless beyond the suburbs. The frozen ground itself protected him. Snow and ice could hide a grave for years. To the police, missing women were simply runaways. To Hansen, they were trophies. He would later mark their graves on a map, tiny red X's across the Alaskan wilderness. Each one represented a life ended, a victory he alone understood. And when investigators finally uncovered that map, years later, they realized how long his shadow had stretched and how many nights Anchorage had slept while a killer baked bread for breakfast. By 1980, Hansen's compulsion had become ritual. He hunted not for need, but for the thrill of the chase. He had mastered the art of pretending, smiling at customers, laughing with fellow hunters, even attending church. But every so often, he'd drive down 4th Avenue again, scanning for his next victim. He was a man who could bake cinnamon rolls at sunrise and bury a body by dusk. Soon, the wilderness would begin to give up its secrets. Bodies would surface, police would whisper, and Anchorage would slowly realize that the most dangerous man in Alaska wasn't the outlaw in the bar, but the quiet baker behind the counter. The hunter had perfected his craft. The city just didn't know it was being hunted. The night air in Anchorage carried a different chill, not the kind that numbs the skin, but the kind that seeps deeper, whispering that something isn't right. It was the early 1980s, the height of the pipeline boom. Men outnumbered women nearly 10 to 1. Bars pulsed with music and sweat. Strip clubs flashed neon promises of warmth against the cold. The city was alive, but beneath that pulse was decay. In this city of wanderers and survivors, no one noticed when women began to vanish. 4th Avenue was the artery of Anchorage's underworld, a place where lost souls bartered dreams for dollars. The women who worked there came from everywhere: Texas, Oregon, Seattle, small towns where the horizon never changed. They came north for money or escape, or just to disappear for a while. One of them was Joanna Messina, 24, bright-eyed, fiercely independent. She told friends she wanted to save enough to start over, maybe open her own salon. Then, one evening in May 1980, she got into a car with a man who offered her a quick job, a photo shoot for cash. She was never seen again. Another was Sherry Morrow, a dancer with a heart-shaped face who always wore a gold necklace. She disappeared in November 1981. Her friends said she'd left with a nice guy, quiet, polite, maybe a client, maybe a boyfriend. Her body was found a year later in the frozen sand of the Nick River. She was still wearing that gold necklace, shot 3 times in the back. No shell casings. The killer had picked them up, a hunter's discipline. The police didn't see a pattern. Anchorage was transient. People came and went like the tide. Dancers moved clubs. Sex workers left town after fights or arrests. The disappearances blurred together, names blending into case numbers. To the cops, these women were high risk. To Hansen, they were perfect prey. He watched them with the patience of a sniper. He learned their habits, who had friends who worked alone, who needed quick cash. His stutter, once his shame, became part of his disguise. He seemed harmless, even kind. He'd offer them hundreds of dollars for an hour's company, sometimes promising to take them to his cabin or on a private trip. When they agreed, the trap closed silently. Inside his truck, the mood changed. A gun, a pair of handcuffs, the sound of chains. Then the wilderness. Robert Hansen's favorite hunting ground lay deep in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley near the Knik River, where birch trees stood like bones against the snow. He'd fly his small plane there, the Piper Super Cub, with his victim blindfolded beside him, wrists bound. The engine's roar drowned her screams. When they landed, he'd take her to a clearing or an old hunting site. There the performance began. He'd untie her, let her think she could run. Sometimes he'd even smile if you make it out you're free. But she never was. He hunted them like deer. He watched them stumble through the brush, barefoot, sobbing, leaving red trails in the snow. He followed slowly, savoring the fear his rifle steady against his shoulder. Sometimes it took hours, sometimes days. And when he was done, he'd drag the body into a shallow grave, mark the spot on his map with a small red X, and fly home back to his bakery, back to his life. By 1982, bodies were surfacing, hunters finding bones in shallow graves, the soil still frozen around them. Detectives called them the Eklutna Annie cases, named for the road near where the first unidentified body was found. She had been stabbed to death, her face unrecognizable. Then came Morrow. Then Paula Goulding, found near the Knik River, also shot, also posed. The coroner noted something disturbing. The bullets came from the same gun, a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle. Whoever was killing these women was methodical, deliberate, and skilled. Each kill site showed no sign of struggle beyond what the wildlife left behind. Each victim was placed face down, hands bound or folded, almost respectfully. Almost. But the respect was a lie. It was control even in death. While police searched the woods, Hansen baked cinnamon rolls for the local Rotary Club. He sponsored hunting trips with friends. He took photos of his children in front of Christmas lights. His bakery was famous for its pies. Even officers from the precinct stopped by for coffee and donuts. They never imagined the same hands that dusted pastries with sugar had buried bodies under frost. The duality was complete, the family man by day, the hunter by night. In his basement, Hansen kept souvenirs, jewelry, ID cards, small Polaroids of terrified faces, each one a trophy. He would later tell investigators they reminded him of his hunting trips. The distinction between animal and human had vanished long ago. In June 1983, the cycle cracked. A 17-year-old girl named Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen's home barefoot, handcuffed, and terrified. She flagged down a truck driver on 6th Avenue, sobbing that a man had chained her in his basement, tortured her, and planned to fly her into the bush to kill her. The driver took her to a nearby motel and called the police. When detectives questioned her, she described Hansen's house, his plane, even the trophies on his wall. Her story was so specific, so vivid, it couldn't be fabricated. Yet the man she accused, Robert Hansen, didn't fit the profile. He was polite, helpful, and respected. When police interviewed him, he played the part perfectly. He even invited them into his bakery, offering pastries while denying everything. They left unconvinced, but one man, Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers, couldn't shake the feeling that Cindy was telling the truth. What no one yet knew was that Hansen kept a hidden map, a topographical sheet of the Knik River Valley covered in tiny red X marks. Each X represented a grave. 17 of them, maybe more. He hid it behind the headboard of his bed, folded neatly as if it were a hunting log. To him, it was just that. To the world, it would become one of the most chilling artifacts in true crime history. The wilderness that had once swallowed the screams of his victims would soon give them back one by one. By late 1983, the whispers in Anchorage turned to fear. Women warned each other not to go alone. Taxi drivers refused to pick up dancers from the clubs after midnight. The word serial killer began to surface in coffee shops and police briefings, though few dared to say it aloud. The city had begun to suspect the unthinkable, that the man next door, the one who smiled as he served you a warm pie, might also be the one who buried nightmares in the snow. The hunter's world was beginning to collapse, though he didn't know it yet. For every X on that map there was now a trail leading back to him, and Detective Glenn Floth was about to follow it. The snow had begun to melt in Anchorage, revealing what winter had buried. It was 1983, and the city's long freeze was ending not just in the landscape, but in the case that had haunted the police for years. Detective Glenn Floth stood in his small office surrounded by maps, reports, and photographs of missing women. Each face told a story that had ended somewhere in the wilderness, and the pattern was too precise to ignore. The city had its monster. The only question left was who. By summer, 4 bodies had been discovered in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, all young women, all sex workers, all killed by a .223 caliber weapon. They were buried miles apart, but connected by precision. No personal belongings, no witnesses, no mistakes. Floth had worked homicide long enough to recognize obsession when he saw it. "This isn't random," he told his team. "Someone is hunting them." The FBI's behavioral science unit agreed. They built a psychological profile based on the killer's methods: organized, methodical, socially adequate, possibly married, probably someone respected in the community. He'd be an outdoorsman, comfortable with weapons, maybe even a pilot, someone who knew how to navigate Alaska's remote wilderness. The profile was chillingly accurate. It described Robert Hansen almost perfectly. The hunter's mask. At that moment, Hansen was living his double life as seamlessly as ever. By day, he baked cinnamon rolls and eclairs in his small shop on 9th Avenue. Customers loved him, especially local police officers who stopped by for coffee. At night, he cleaned his rifles, checked his maps, and stared at Polaroids of terrified women like a hunter reviewing old trophies. He thought he was safe. He had survived dozens of close calls. Earlier charges of abduction and assault had vanished in courtrooms that didn't take the word of girls from 4th Avenue over a mild-mannered family man. The law had failed to see through the mask. But this time, the cracks were showing. Cindy Paulson's escape was the thread that began to unravel everything. When she told her story, the basement that changed the plane, most officers dismissed it as fantasy. But Detective Floth listened. Every detail she described matched something real: the interior of Hansen's house, his red and white Piper plane, the trophies mounted on his walls. Still, Hansen denied it all. He had an alibi. His wife and friends swore he'd been with them that night. He even took a polygraph and passed, but Floth wasn't fooled. "He's too calm," he told his team. "He's rehearsed this." To prove it, he needed evidence, hard physical proof that would tie Hansen to the murders. And that meant a search warrant. But to get one, he needed probable cause, and for that he'd have to connect a respectable baker to a series of mutilated corpses scattered across Alaska's frozen heart. Floth worked in silence for months, retracing Hansen's life piece by piece. He studied flight logs from Merrill Field Airport and noticed a pattern: the baker's short solo trips often coincided with the dates women went missing. He matched maps, time frames, and bullet types. He pulled records of guns registered to Hansen, including a Ruger Mini 14 rifle identical to the murder weapon. Bit by bit, the picture came together. The polite baker had become the prime suspect in one of the most brutal killing sprees in American history. Floth brought in the FBI profiler John Douglas, the same expert who would later inspire Mindhunter. Douglas's report described the killer as a man who felt inadequate around women, with a history of being bullied or rejected. He'd compensate through domination, turning his hunting skills into a ritual of power. When Floth read the report, he didn't hesitate. "We're talking about Hansen," he said. "It's him." On October 27, 1983, a team of troopers assembled in the early dawn outside Hansen's modest home. The street was quiet frost clinging to the windows. Inside, Hansen was still asleep when they knocked. He opened the door calmly, wearing glasses and a robe, as if this were just another morning. The warrant was read aloud. The officers filed in careful, methodical, the way he had been in his hunts. They searched every inch of the house. The basement smelled faintly of oil and metal. A small space behind a workbench drew attention, a hidden area with chains bolted to the wall. Nearby, they found a collection of jewelry, driver's licenses, and ID cards belonging to missing women. Then came the most damning discovery of all, a folded topographical map of the Nick River Valley marked with 21 tiny red X's. Each X matched a known burial site. Some marked places where bodies had already been found. Others pointed to locations the police hadn't yet discovered. Hansen's trophies weren't just memories, they were coordinates. Over the next days, the evidence multiplied. From his attic, police recovered weapons including the Ruger Mini-14 rifle and a .357 revolver, both ballistically matched to bullets recovered from victims' bodies. In a storage box, they found Polaroid photos of women alive, terrified, handcuffed, their eyes pleading. The women in those photos were later confirmed as missing persons. Hansen's calm demeanor began to erode. He was taken into custody, maintaining his innocence even as the weight of his own meticulous record-keeping collapsed around him. His wife Darla watched in disbelief as officers carried out boxes of evidence. The image of the quiet baker shattered completely. At first, Hansen denied everything. For hours he sat across from Detective Floth in a stark interrogation room, his hands folded, his stutter worse than ever. But as the evidence piled up, the map, the rifle, the jewelry, the silence grew unbearable. Finally his voice cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt them," he whispered. "It just got out of hand." What followed was a confession that chilled even the most hardened investigators. He described the hunts in cold, mechanical detail, how he'd kidnap women, fly them to remote sites, release them, then stalk them with his rifle. He laughed nervously, even smiled at times as though recounting hunting stories rather than murders. He admitted to killing at least 17 women, though the true number remains uncertain. For each victim, he remembered the weapon, the flight path, even the position of the body, like a man recalling trophies from a lifetime of sport. When Hansen finally stopped talking, the room was silent, except for the hum of the tape recorder. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, indifferent, as if trying once more to cover what had been unearthed. The city of Anchorage, once blind to the danger lurking in its heart, now faced its truth, that evil had lived among them, smiling behind a bakery counter, hunting beneath their sky. Detective Floth looked over the case files, exhausted. The image of that map burned into his mind. Each red X was a life, a name, a scream, swallowed by the cold. The ice had finally broken, and from beneath it the truth had crawled out, shivering but undeniable. The snow was falling again over Anchorage, soft, relentless, indifferent. For most people it was just another Alaskan winter. For the detectives who had chased Robert Hansen for years, it felt like the world trying to erase the evidence all over again. Inside the interrogation room, the air was heavy. The tape machine clicked softly as Hansen's voice filled the silence, calm, steady, almost clinical. He was no longer the quiet baker or the polite family man. In that small, gray room, stripped of his apron and glasses, he was exactly what the wilderness had always known him to be, a predator, explaining his method. Hansen's confession lasted hours. He spoke in a low tone, sometimes stuttering, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to remember details. To the detectives, his precision was both a gift and a curse. He remembered everything, the location of each body, the angle of each shot, even the weather on the day of the hunt. "I'd let them run," he admitted softly, eyes unfocused. "Give them a head start." It made it more interesting. He said it the way other men talk about chess. Floth listened without speaking. The man across from him was small, unremarkable, wearing a gray sweater that hung loose on his shoulders. There was no rage, no thrill, just a chilling normalcy. "I never planned to kill that many." Hansen continued. "It just got out of hand." He blamed the women. Said they tempted him, mocked him. Said they made him feel powerless. Each word was a window into a twisted mind that saw the world as a game of dominance. The detectives wrote everything down, every pause, every nervous laugh. They knew that once the confession ended, the next battle would begin in court. After the confession, investigators flew with Hansen over the Nick River Valley. From the air, the landscape looked endless. A white wilderness broken by patches of gray rock and shadow. Each time they reached a red X on his map, Hansen pointed out the window. There, he'd say simply. At one site, they uncovered the remains of Eklutna Annie, the first known victim. At another, they found Sherry Morrow still wearing her gold necklace, then Paula Goulding, then others. The snow gave up its dead one by one, as if the land itself was tired of holding secrets. The final body count reached 17 confirmed victims, though Hansen hinted at more. He said some graves were too remote to find. The police believed him. When the flights ended, Floth folded the map carefully and sealed it in evidence. It wasn't just a document anymore. It was a monument to the lives Hansen had taken, to every scream the ice had swallowed. The district attorney knew the case was airtight, but also fragile. The evidence, though overwhelming, was complex, scattered across miles of wilderness. A long, drawn-out trial could risk appeals and uncertainty. So prosecutors made a deal. Hansen would plead guilty to 4 murders, those with the strongest physical evidence, in exchange for a full confession and details on all his other victims. It was a bitter compromise, but one that ensured the truth would finally be written down piece by piece. On February 27, 1984, Robert Hansen appeared in Anchorage Superior Court. The courtroom was small, lined with reporters, officers, and the families of the missing. He wore a brown suit, glasses, and an expression of detached politeness. When the judge asked if he understood the charges, murder, kidnapping, rape, arson, theft, he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he said softly. His voice trembled only once when the prosecutor read aloud the names of his victims. The prosecution presented the evidence with brutal clarity. Photos of shallow graves, ballistics reports linking his rifle to bullets found in the bodies, the map, the jewelry, the Polaroids. One by one, the victims' names echoed through the courtroom. Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Goulding, Eklutna Annie, and others still listed as Jane Does. Their families wept quietly. For years they had begged for answers. Now the answers were here, but they offered no comfort. When the tape of Hansen's confession played, the room fell silent. His voice, calm and emotionless, described how he had released women into the wild, how he had watched them run. At one point, the judge looked away. Hansen's defense attorney argued that his client suffered from severe mental illness, bipolar disorder, and antisocial personality traits. But the court saw no excuse. There was no insanity here, only choice repeated 17 times. On March 18, 1984, the judge delivered his ruling. Robert Christian Hansen was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. Hansen stood still, hands folded, staring down at the table. He didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't look at the families. He just nodded once, as though acknowledging a business transaction. Detective Floth, standing in the back, felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only exhaustion. The monster was finally caged, but the damage he left behind would never thaw. "There's no justice in this," he later said. "Only closure." After the trial, Hansen was transferred to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, a maximum security facility surrounded by mountains and snow. He lived there quietly for decades, baking bread for other inmates, keeping to himself. He never apologized. When reporters asked if he regretted what he'd done, he shrugged. "You can't undo what's been done," he said once. "I just did what I did." Over time, he faded from the headlines, but not from the collective memory of Alaska. His story became a ghost that haunted the wilderness, a warning of how civilization and savagery can coexist in one man. For the women of Anchorage, the scars ran deep. Many of the city's laws and police procedures changed after Hansen's conviction. Tighter checks on missing persons, better coordination between precincts, and most importantly, a vow never again to dismiss the voices of the vulnerable. Because Cindy Paulson, the girl who escaped, had been right all along, and because so many others never got the chance to run. In the years that followed, psychologists studied Hansen's case as a perfect example of compartmentalized psychopathy, a man capable of living 2 lives without contradiction. He could bake for his neighbors in the morning and bury his victims at night. He didn't fit the image of a monster, and that was what made him so terrifying. When he died in 2014 at the age of 75 in a prison hospital bed, the news was met with silence. No one mourned. Alaska at last could sleep without looking over its shoulder. But in the wilderness, the wind still moved through the trees where the red X's once marked the ground, a reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers politely from behind the counter. The wind over the Nick River sounds different now. It still howls through the birch trees, still bites the skin, but for those who know the story, there's something else in it. An echo, a whisper of the lives that ended there. Alaska never forgot Robert Hansen. You can't forget something that close, something that quiet. Even decades later, The shadow of the butcher-baker still stretches across its frozen landscape. Every winter, when the snow begins to fall, troopers patrolling the valley still find bones hunters' remains, missing hikers, the occasional skeleton unearthed by erosion. Most belong to accidents, not murder. But each discovery brings a brief silence, a pause, as if the earth itself hesitates before giving up its secrets again. For years after Hansen's arrest, police would return to the spots marked by the red X's on his map, rechecking every ridge and clearing. Some graves had already been emptied by animals, others were too deep, too remote, forever lost under shifting ice. Even now there are women whose names are still unknown, only coordinates on a hunter's map. Anchorage built new subdivisions where the wilderness once began. The forest was pushed back by houses, grocery stores, schools. But beneath those foundations, the land remembers. Locals call the Knik River Valley Hansen's ground. Few say it out loud. The survivors silence. Cindy Paulson, the girl who escaped and ultimately ended Hansen's reign of terror, vanished from public life after the trial. She refused interviews for decades. In court, she had sat behind the prosecution table trembling as the man who chained her described his crimes in the same voice he used to order flour for his bakery. When the sentencing ended, she walked out of the courtroom straight into the snow and never looked back. Years later, when she was tracked down by journalists, she said only one sentence: "He was polite until he wasn't." That line became a ghost story of its own, repeated by every woman who's ever been told to trust the quiet ones. Anchorage learned from its silence. The Hansen case exposed a truth many had ignored, that the city's most vulnerable, the women of Fourth Avenue, the transient workers, the lost, were invisible until they were gone. In the years that followed, Alaska restructured how it handled missing persons cases. Police no longer dismissed reports from sex workers as runaways. Social programs emerged, shelters were built, and an entire unit was dedicated to the safety of women working in high-risk areas. Hansen's crimes forced the city to look at itself in the mirror, and what it saw wasn't pretty. For Detective Glenn Floth, the man who had refused to let the case go, the victory felt hollow. "We didn't catch him soon enough," he said in a later interview. "Too many died before anyone listened." He retired quietly, his walls still covered with case photos and maps. The wilderness outside his window reminded him every day of the hunt he had ended and the ones he couldn't. Robert Hansen became a myth the moment the handcuffs clicked. Documentaries, books, and films tried to capture him. The Frozen Ground, 2013, with Nicolas Cage and John Cusack, told his story again for a new generation. But the real horror never fit neatly into a script. The truth wasn't cinematic. It was quieter. It was the sound of a pickup door closing, the click of handcuffs in a dark basement, the beating of wings from a plane disappearing into the fog. Even now, the locals speak his name with discomfort, as if saying it too clearly might bring him back. Parents warn their daughters about the quiet ones. Hunters joke about Hansen country when the GPS loses signal. The laughter never lasts long. Psychologists later described Hansen's case as a phenomenon of isolation, the collision between wilderness and ego. Alaska is a place that rewards control skill and self-reliance. It attracts men who want to conquer something, a mountain, the weather themselves. Hansen turned that need into a ritual. He couldn't conquer his humiliation, so he conquered others. Dr. Helen Fisher, a criminal psychologist who reviewed the case in 1991, called him a man built for Alaska, cold, efficient, detached. She meant it not as praise, but as warning. In a place where nature is indifferent to life or death, Hansen found reflection. The wilderness didn't judge him, it only waited. And that perhaps is what terrified people most, that the land itself seemed to conspire with him. The snow covered his crimes, the animals erased his tracks, and for 12 long years the silence protected him better than any alibi. When Robert Hansen died in 2014, the Alaskan Department of Corrections issued a short statement. Inmate Robert C. Hansen, 75, deceased at 1:05 a.m., Alaska Regional Hospital. No mention of his crimes, no funeral, no mourners. His remains were quietly cremated. Outside, the sky over Seward was clear, rare for autumn. Some said it was fitting. Even nature seemed done with him. But the silence he left behind didn't fade. It lingered in police archives, in the minds of the officers who dug up his victims, and in the frozen soil of the valley where he once ruled as both man and monster. Hansen's story became more than true crime. It became part of Alaska's identity, a cautionary tale about the darkness that hides in plain sight. The case is still taught in criminal psychology courses as one of the most chilling examples of organized psychopathy, a man capable of absolute normalcy and absolute evil at the same time. And so even now, when the first snow falls over Anchorage and the streets turn white again, the city remembers. Because every footprint in the snow, every echo across the valley, is a reminder that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. Sometimes it smiles and hands you a warm loaf of bread. In the end, Alaska didn't just survive Hansen's reign, it adapted. The wilderness remains vast and indifferent, but its people no longer are. They remember the 17 names, the 17 stories that almost vanished into the cold. They remember the detective who refused to let go, the survivor who ran barefoot through the streets, and the quiet man who thought he could outlast the snow. But the thing about Alaska is, this nothing stays buried forever. The land forgets nothing. And every winter when the wind moves through the trees, it sounds like a warning, the soft, eternal whisper of all those who ran and never returned. The snow still falls over Anchorage the same way it did when Robert Hansen walked its streets, quiet, steady, indifferent. The city has grown since then. The bars of 4th Avenue are gone, replaced by coffee shops and neon-lit diners. The air smells of diesel and frost. But if you listen carefully beneath the hum of modern life, the old silence is still there, the one that used to swallow screams. Hansen is gone. His plane grounded his bakery dust, his voice lost to time. Yet his shadow remains stitched into the fabric of Alaska like a scar that never fully fades. The wilderness he once used as a hunting ground now stands as a memorial not to him, but to the women whose names were nearly forgotten. When the wind moves through the valley, the birch trees creak like bones remembering their shape. The land is vast, but memory is deeper still. In Anchorage, the police files still sit in the archives, photographs, maps yellowing statements written by hands that trembled as they described what they'd seen. Some of those officers have passed on, others have retired, but all of them carried a piece of the case with them. They say you can't unsee what the snow hides. You can only hope to understand why it hid it for so long. For the survivors' justice was a strange kind of silence. There were no headlines that could return the lost years, no sentences long enough to thaw the grief. Cindy Paulson, the one who ran, the one who spoke when no one else could, she gave Alaska its voice back. Every victim since owes her something. She is the proof that courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it just keeps breathing. And what of Hansen? History will remember him as the butcher-baker, the man who hunted people as though they were animals. But beneath the horror lies a simpler, colder truth. He was ordinary, unremarkable. That's what makes evil so terrifying. It doesn't always wear a mask of madness. Sometimes it bakes bread. Sometimes it smiles when it hands you change. That ordinariness is the real legacy he left behind, the reminder that monsters don't always live in the dark. Sometimes they live next door. Today, the Nick River still freezes each winter, erasing the trails, smoothing the ground as if offering mercy. But when the thaw comes, when the ice breaks and the water begins to move again, it carries whispers, the echoes of 17 lost voices, the stories of those who ran and never came back. They are not forgotten. They live in the files, in the frost, in the quiet prayers of a city that learned to listen too late. The snow falls and the land keeps its silence. But beneath that silence, Alaska remembers, always.